Falsha, you are very welcome to this edition of Mind Your Precious Self. And our topic this edition is holistic grieving. Now you might think, gosh, that's a very morbid topic, or one that maybe you don't want to particularly deal with. However, there are three certainties in life: birth, change, and death. We're going to have to deal with it at some point, and it's best to be prepared. However, if we look at grieving for many things, perhaps a beloved, but also perhaps for a phase of life that you've passed, or also for something that was not meant to be, then there is an element of, this is going to happen anyway, this change is coming, but I am prepared. And therefore, this talk is about that preparation, and perhaps about looking at aspects of grieving that you might not have thought about in a holistic perspective. It might be that you have come to grieving previously and you found it very difficult, and you're here to find alternative ways. Or it could be that somebody in your family is in palliative care or in a hospice, and you recognise that soon the inevitable will happen. Or you might be recognising that there's a phase of your life coming to an end, and there is that sense of sadness of, oh gosh, what if, what was that all about? Can I extend it? Is it time to let it go? And if the answer to any of those is a yes, then you're in the right place. I have to say that it's important for us to go back into the mists of time here in Ireland, this tiny little island off the west coast of Ireland, where for millennia we had a very healthy attitude towards grieving and death. Now you might have heard that when it was Granny's time to die, she was laid out in her casket for everyone to see. Not in a morbid way, as I referred to earlier on, but so that people could look in to see her physical body, but recognise that her life force was missing. In other words, this was Granny's body, but that her very essence, her soul, her spirit, whatever you might refer to it as, had gone somewhere else. Also, there was what we refer to as a wake, and this is a really key word. The wake went on for 3 days, where Granny's favourite food and drink were served, and there was a celebration of her life. And what was wonderful was, yes, of course, she was talked about for all her wonderful merits and what a lovely woman she was, and wasn't she a great knitter, and she was so kind. But equally, any eulogies were there. You would recognise Granny. I mean, maybe she was a bit mean, or maybe she could be a bit grumpy at times. It wasn't sanitised as sometimes it is these days, where you are at a church or a synagogue, or you're in a place listening to somebody talk about the person who's died, and you don't recognise them because it's all, as I said, sanitised. This, in the wake, was very real. Children were present because it was important to teach them about death, and also the neighbours and the friends. The family, particularly the men folk, dug the grave, and the women folk laid out the body and decorated the grave. And these were very important rituals, physical rituals, that could bring a sense of completion, a sense of support, as Granny was born into a new dimension. There were often the women called Nakina, the criers, 3 women that would sit in the corner and emote and cry. And they were encouraging the family and the friends, particularly those that might find it a little bit hard to emote, to release, because that's a very important part of grieving. Nowadays, we have lost so many of those traditions. And there can be, especially if in our modern world you aren't particularly affiliated to any set religion, So maybe you fall in between the stools. You're coming from a secular place, or you have beliefs, but you're not quite sure where they sit. And there's a gap, a void, an empty place. What are the rituals? What are the ceremonies? If we come from a holistic perspective, it gives us an opportunity to create what we need, recognizing that we all grieve differently. And if your brother or your sister or your partner or your child or your mother grieves in a different way, so be it. It's important that we respect their way, and equally they respect ours. Now, as I mentioned, we can grieve for many things. Somebody who's actually died, but also a phase of our life. I'm sure we've all come across the person who's still going to the nightclubs and they're in their 50s or 60s, and clearly they're with 20-year-olds, and it's time. It's okay. Maybe you should go to the piano bar down the road. Maybe you should join the Zumba class if you love dancing. There's other ways to come to this. Perhaps you are, like me, coming into your mother phase and you're all excited. Oh gosh, will a baby be born? And then you realise it's not meant to be. That it could be infertility. There could be a variety of reasons. Maybe the right partner isn't there, or your partner doesn't particularly want children. And when we come to menopause as women, there is a time of grieving what can no longer be. And interestingly enough, that's not just for women or men who haven't given birth this lifetime, but it also is for women and men who have children, but they've reached a point in that partnership where the woman is beyond childbearing years. And that in itself is a grief. But also, depending on your age, you might look back at your formative years and think, oh, I always want to do this, or I always want to do that, and I'm recognizing that that time has now passed. Personally, I'm a great believer in you're never too old to try something. However, if we are realistic, there are certain practices or maybe studies or ways of being that you recognize that's over now. It's time to grieve. We're going to look at this, as I said, in a holistic way. The body, the mind, and the soul. And depending on where you are, this might be the death of a person, or a phase of life, or something that was not meant to be, as the phrase goes. We'll look at the body first. There are many different theories as to the phases of grief. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is one of the well-known steps. We're talking about shock, we're talking about denial, anger, and then finally acceptance. And other people might talk about, oh, it's 5 steps, it's 7 steps. There's various different theories. But I'm sure you'll agree that when you hear the news that somebody's died, whether they're very close or whether they're from extended family or friend, usually the first reaction is shock. And that numbs the body. There's a, and we need to be with that, not to push it away, but actually to recognize that this is a part of grieving, the first stage often. We might look at others and go, oh, there's Melissa crying, or there's Johnny in a very sad place, and you're not feeling anything. Because with that shock, you might still be in the numbness part. And then I'm spiraling back to the Keeners, Nick Keena, back in the day, and they were the ones to start the crying. And a very simple way to bring on the tears that release is to watch a weepy film, as I call it. The King and I was a famous one for me. Steel Magnolias is another one. The Champ, you know, they're all classics. But you're crying for the people in the film, and then very soon you're crying for Granny or whoever it is that has died. nurturing our body is very important. So often when somebody dies, there might be, oh, I couldn't face food. I really I don't feel like eating anything. And that might be where soups and broths and juices might come in, because we do need to replenish ourselves. And if a full meal is just, oh, I can't face it, then sip something. In fact, back in the day, there was a lovely, which I have to say, it's a tradition that you do come across now and again. And it's where the neighbours for the first month come in and they bring food for the family of the grieving family. And then after the month's mind, they gently back off. And it's time, a signal for the family now to begin to prepare their own meals and to get back into the swing of daily life. And of course, the first year anniversary was a very important time, because that was deemed more or less the time when the grieving was beginning to recede. Many of you might not know, and I have my counselling psychotherapy hat on here, but just like a little one usually begins to walk in around the first year. Now, some children walk at 10 months, some children walk at 14 months, but usually it's around the 10th month. And similarly, the heavy grieving is in the first month, then we grieve for up to a year, and usually around that time, we come to a place of acceptance. If we go beyond that year, and every time you mention Granny or whoever it is that died, you get really upset, then there is some energetic blockage there. And that might be the time to seek a bereavement counsellor. Remember, depending on your belief system, Granny is either gone or she's in a wonderful spiritual place. Or she's in a place we don't even know of. But one way or the other, she's out of pain and she's free of, as Shakespeare would say, her mortal coil. Grieving is all about us, not actually about the person who's died. Therefore, spiralling back to the body, self-care, cozy up under the duvet, watch films, read books, sleep. And that light food, if you find that heavier food is hard to digest, or if you find yourself reaching for comfort food, then it might be, you might think, well, it's only temporary, or you might team it with getting out into nature, wonderful, glorious walks. And I'll circle back to nature in a little bit, and you might be surprised in which way. So that's the body. Let's move on now to the mind. Well, as I said, denial is the next one, and anger. Now you might be surprised. In your mind, there's all these emotions floating around, these feelings, from the shock to the denial, as in you wake up in the morning, you think, oh, I must tell Granny, and then you realise she's not there. Or there's a sense of bargaining. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross really flagged this, and she said, look, sometimes there's why them, why not me? And that can often come about, especially if the person who's died is young or they haven't really lived a full life. There can be a sense of they deserve to live longer. It could have been me. And again, we're coming to terms with this in our head. Expressing the emotion is important. That anger can be directed at many different people. It could be the person who's, why did you die and leave me? It could be the hospital, why couldn't they have saved you? It might be yourself, oh, I wish I was there. It could be towards God or goddess or spirit or whatever you perceive as a higher self. Why did you let this happen? Go through those stages. Cry, release and emote. Feel that anger. I mean, pummel a cushion if you need to, power walk, heavy gardening, whatever it is, just to let it go. And trust that after the anger is released, there will come acceptance. Now, anger might be fleeting. It could be you feel it for 5 minutes, But there are a lot of people stuck in anger for a lifetime. And let me tell you something really interesting. There's a wonderful palliative care nurse, an Australian woman. She wrote this amazing book, and the gist of it was 5 things that people who are close to death, the regrets of the dying, basically. And people regret not loving more, expressing themselves more, spending more time with family. They regret going for their dreams. They regret, you get the idea. Nobody regrets not working harder, as in staying longer at the office than they should do. Nobody regrets making XYZ money. It's all about the personal, the I love yous, the I forgive yous connection. Really interesting. So with the mind, note how you're feeling and then find a way to express it. Recognize that the others around you will emote and grieve in a different way, and that's fine. It won't be the same for everyone. Particularly with children, answer any questions they have. Granny's in a cosy box in the ground. Granny's ashes are scattered. She's at peace now. She's in her beloved sea, or wherever it might be. And I remember once counselling a couple, and somebody very close to them had died. It was a child of theirs, a very hard case, and the woman wanted bereavement counselling, but her partner came for one, engaged fully, and at the end of it, when I mentioned something like this, he said, I think I need to walk the beach with the dogs. Thank you for what you're doing here. I can see how helpful it might be, but this is what I need. His wife, as you can imagine, was horrified, and I said, I hear you. Go and walk those dogs. Thank you for coming for this one. That's what you need. And the wife continued. This is recognizing how somebody else grieves. Now, while we're still on the subject of mind, keep in mind that some days you will just want to pull the duvet over your head and cry and remember beloved granny. But some days you might find yourself laughing at somebody's joke and be almost surprised, oh my gosh, should I be laughing because granny's died? Yes, if you feel like laughing. In other words, there'll be a little bit of a seesaw approach. Some days great, other days not. Some days for 3 or 4 hours you manage to distract yourself from the grief, and then other days you're mired in it for the whole day. This is normal. This is how it goes when you're grieving. Let it happen. And talk to people. Let your friends, let the listeners around you in. Let them nurture you during this time. I remember when my dad died, he died at 53, he was quite young. And I remember the office that I worked in London at the time. Oh, they were so sweet. They got me this huge basket of Body Shop, lovely smellies and oils and whatever. And they gave it to me to self-care. And I really appreciate it. It was not a beautiful gesture. But a couple of weeks later when I came back, we would be talking about something and I would say, oh yes, my dad loved that. And they'd all go, huh? And I'm going, it's okay. I need to talk about him. I want to talk about him. I can reference him and smile. I'm not going to get upset. And if I do you know, that's okay too. Let's move on now from the body, the mind, to the soul aspect. Now, some of you will think, okay, this makes complete sense when you were talking about grieving, that the spiritual will come into it. However, for many people who may not have spiritual beliefs, they might go, well, now you're losing me. Bear with me. Let's talk about nature and let's talk about the marvelous coincidence and synchronicities of how we get a sense that our loved one is at peace, and how that phase of our life we have gently let it go. The great Carl Jung, many, many moons ago, really talked about coincidence and serendipity. And this means it could be repeating signs, it could be an aha moment, it might be an inner knowing. There's different ways of coming to it. And I'll give you some classics. When someone dies, often a person in the extended family has a very vivid dream. And usually in the dream, that person is waving, smiling, and walking through a door or down a tunnel or leaving a place. In other words, I'm fine, I'm off now, everything's fine. And sometimes in those vivid dreams, the person who's died is much younger. In other words, Granny might have died at 85, and in the dream, she looks about 60. Maybe how the person remembers her when they were a child. Often there are those synchronicities. The same song keeps playing on the radio. So let's say Grandad absolutely adored Frank Sinatra. I Did It My Way. That was his favourite song. And everywhere you go, that song is playing. Now, it is a common song, but you don't hear it all the time. In other words, if it's in 3 times in quick succession, it might be a sign that Grandad's telling me that he's fine. Another classic is the little robin hopping around the garden. We associate robins with December, with Christmas time, and they're there all year round, but they don't tend to come forward as much as other times of the year. They're not as obvious. And if one suddenly randomly appears in your garden and comes up quite close, then that might be a sign that uncle is fine, or auntie, or mum, or dad, or whoever it might be. It might be a particular book. Somebody says, oh, have you read Wuthering Heights? Fabulous book. And you think, oh my gosh, that was mum's favourite book. And then randomly, seemingly, a couple of days later, somebody gives you a present of Wuthering Heights. And then lo and behold, the film is on the television and you go, okay, that for me is mum saying, I'm fine, all is well. Again, very personal. Tap into whatever beliefs you may have. If you are Catholic, if you're Muslim, if you are Church of Ireland, if you are whatever faith or no faith, if nature speaks to you, well then let the solace come from whatever saints or deities or angels that are part of your belief system. Solace is really, really a wonderful comfort at this time. We're recognizing that grieving is part of life. Yes, it is painful, but everybody has to go through it. And there is an old story of how a woman is bereft because her father dies and she can't stand the pain. So she goes to the wise woman at the edge of the forest and she says, please, this is too much for me. I can't take this. Please take it away. And the wise woman says, I will. But first, you must go to every household in the village and you must tell them what's happened and what you're wishing for. So the young woman thought, oh, okay, whatever I need to take this pain away. And she goes to every house in the village and she explains, my beloved father died and I want to take the pain away. And the people began to talk to her of how they grieved for their loved ones and how cathartic it was and how much they learnt about themselves and how they came to that place of acceptance. And by the time she had gone to the last family, she went back to the wise woman and she says, thank you. I understand. Yes, this is part of life and grieving is important. And I too will take my place and go through this just as everybody else has. I have not come across one household that have not had their grieving process. I understand. For many of us, when we are in a grieving situation, it's the first time we contemplate the big questions in life. What is the meaning of life? is there life after death? What are my spiritual beliefs? Where did I come from? What is the soul? What is spirit? What is God, goddess? You get the idea. And these are often I suppose these great questions in life that we think, someday I'll think about that. But when somebody dies, it is time to really ponder these and to listen to our hearts, to come from our head down to our hearts and to really get a sense of, I understand. This is what it's about. There are conscious ways of going through the grieving process. The holistic way may be a great help to you, but ultimately it's about your grieving process. And it will be different for everyone. However, as a gentle marker, the first month is the heavy grieving. Accept the help that you can. The full year is still grieving on, off, that little bit of a seesaw. But after the first year, that's when we move into a place of full acceptance. And if you find yourself, as I said before, full of tears or full of regrets, then there is something to be worked on. There's a blockage or there's an issue there. And bereavement counsellors or a good listener in the family may be what you need. This is one of the biggest changes in life, and it comes to us all. And we recognise that. Yes, I understand. Just like everybody else, this is now my time. For those of you who perhaps have had a loved one in a hospital or a nursing home or maybe palliative care, hospice, and you regret not being there when they've died. Once again, I heard a beautiful tale from somebody who works in the nursing profession, and she said, those who are dying often need to slip away quietly and silently and gently. And if they're surrounded by family or friends or people who they love dearly, it's harder to slip away. I've heard time and time again of families having a 24/7 vigil around the hospital bed, and somebody goes to the toilet, somebody goes for a brief cup of coffee, and that's when Granny slips away. Please, if you are in that situation, do not worry or do not feel that you weren't there for them. You were. But in those quiet moments, it's so much easier for them to slip away into the other world. And whether you regard that as heaven, Valhalla, the other world, whatever your belief system is, they are in a place of no pain, a place of no physicality. And the grieving process is all about us. And we can, and time again we do, face that big change, the biggest change of them all, and grieve holistically. Mila Bricus, 1,000 thanks. I hope that was helpful. As always, you may email me, KarenWardTherapist@gmail.com, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. This is part of the Mind Your Precious Self series, and it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to so many of you. And I know many of you also listen to the recordings as well when they're up on the YouTube, which is marvellous. And I'm always open to suggestions as well, if any of you have any.